All right, Alexander, let's do an update on what's going on in Ukraine. I guess the big story is that we do have an offensive shaping up, not a counteroffensive, but an offensive, and it's coming from Russia and it's towards the Nikolayev region. But I've also seen a lot of activity in and around Kharkov as well. So, what's the situation in Ukraine?
Well, it seems to me that you've actually put your finger on the key event, because we were all led to expect that there was going to be this great counteroffensive by Ukraine in southwest Ukraine. They were going to take Kherson region. They were going to drive the Russians back across the Dnieper. They were going to threaten Crimea. And in fact, what's happening is the actual reverse. The Russians are advancing where they were supposed to be retreating. And they're now closing in on Nikolayev. And it's always very difficult to judge what the Russians are actually planning on any particular moment. I mean, it could be, some people have suggested to me in emails that they're outflanking the Ukrainians, so that if the Ukrainians do launch an advance on Kherson region, which I don't actually take seriously anymore, that the Russians are now positioned to strike at their rear. But it seems to me that the information we're getting now points increasingly to Nikolaev actually being a potential Russian target. And it would make sense. This is a big city. It's about the same size as Mariupol, by the way, just to give some context. It's a big city. It's an industrial center. It's apparently rather easier to capture than Mariupol because it's got very broad streets, and it's more easy to send troops up through it. It's not divided. It doesn't, but it has this major shipyard, which is apparently lying idle, which was built all the way back in the 18th century. It was first started by Catherine the Great, and then it became the biggest shipyard in the Russian Empire, and it was a very important shipyard in the Soviet era. It's a place that would be, I think, relatively easy to supply, because you could send barges and ships up the southern Bug River to Nikolaev, and of course it brings you closer to Odessa. And it seems to be logical that the Russians would at some point want to take Nikolaev, and why not now, given that, as I said, the Ukrainians seem to be crumbling in various places. Now, that makes me ask a question about whether some of this Ukrainian activity that we've been seeing, the missile strikes on the bridges across the Dnieper River, the Antonovsky Bridge near Kherson City, the bridge over the Novaya Kharkova Dam, whether these these attacks might not actually have been to prevent a Russian build-up west of the Dnieper to advance on Nikolaev, rather than to prepare for that Ukrainian offensive on Kherson region. It begins to look more plausible that it's actually that way round. And the other thing that's really very interesting is that about a week ago, there was a major roundup of people in Nikolaev. The governor of Nikolaev ordered what was essentially a 3-day lockdown, and the Ukrainian security forces were going from house to house, basically searching and arresting people and looking for Russian spies. Now, that, looking back on it, again suggests that the Ukrainians are getting worried that there's a threat to Nikolaev. And you've just mentioned Kharkov. I understand that something similar is now happening there, that the Ukrainian authorities in Kharkov are also carrying out, in effect, house-to-house searches, zooming in, trying to find, winkle out people who they say might be Russian spies in Kharkov, which suggests that the Ukrainians are worried that their hold of both cities are starting to become precarious. I should say that Kharkov is a much bigger place than Nikolaev. It's more than twice the size. So, I mean, there's no comparison in that respect. But, of course, Kharkiv is much closer to the Russian borders. So it's a logical place for the Russians to move on once the fighting in Donbass ends.
What about the news about some Ukrainian activity in and around Kherson or Nikolayev, where they've captured certain villages that you hear every now and then? Is there any truth to that?
Which villages? I mean, this is always the problem. I mean, they did advance towards the Ingulets River, which is a river to the north of this area that we're talking about, and which is, on the northern flank of the Russian advance towards Nikolayev. But the attempt to try and cross that river has been a consistent failure. They've tried it several times. And there was a lot of talk that this is all going to be, the staging point for the great advance on Kherson region. I'm now again, and always I have to qualify this by saying that this isn't an area of things where I have great expertise. I don't have any military expertise, but if you go back to what happened in Donbass, the Russians advanced, captured a city called ETHEREUM. And that created a big Russian bridgehead, which has been the base area for Russian advance towards Slavyansk. And the Ukrainians have been trying to obstruct the advance of that bridgehead by attacking this Russian force, which is facing south on its western flanks, by trying to launch river crossings across the Seversky Donets River, all of which, by the way, have failed. And I suspect, I'm now starting to think that this Ukrainian attempt to establish a bridgehead across the Ingulets River is exactly the same thing. It's not really intended for an advance on Kherson region. It's more intended to try to slow the Russian advance towards Nikolayev by creating a threat to the Russian forces on their northern flank. So, you could start to see some parallels, and it seems to me that this is more consistent because every Ukrainian attempt to advance beyond the Ingulets River has resulted in the Ukrainians being thrown back with very heavy losses.
Right. What's the weapons and economic situation with regards to Ukraine?
Right. Well, weapons supplies have, to a great extent, dwindled. We've had a report from this institute, the Kiel Institute in Germany, which says that the European countries failed to make any commitments over the whole of July to supply Ukraine with any more weapons. We've now had a very bizarre announcement from Olaf Scholz that he's talking to Canada about Canada supplying weapon systems to Ukraine. So Germany is now turning to Canada for Canada to supply these weapon systems. Of course, Canada's capacity to do so is probably fairly limited. But anyway, Europe isn't providing weapon systems. And we've now had the latest announcements from the US. And I'm drawing here heavily on an analysis of them by Brian Beletic. And he has said, and he's gone through them in detail, and again, they look like they don't amount to very much. One's impression is, I've been saying this for months, by the way, that US military supplies to Ukraine are slackening. So 16 small surveillance drones, these are handheld drones that you send up and then look over the battlefield. They're useful, but there's only 16 of them. For comparison, the Russians have around 1,500 analogous drones that they're using in Ukraine. So that gives you some idea. A small number of rather lighter guns than the guns the US provided before. More ammunition for the HIMARS system. But the reports again suggest that the HIMARS ammunition supplies are running down, not just in Ukraine, but in the United States too. So it's nowhere near enough to make any significant changes to the battlefields. Whereas we're getting more and more economic reports about the situation in Ukraine, and they are cumulatively now pointing to a very severe inflation crisis. There was a report, there was a memo sent to Ukraine, a letter by a group of international economists, including Ken Rogoff, by the way, of Harvard University, a man called Sergei Guriev, who's a dissident Russian economist who's now gone and works for the World Bank, I believe, or at least, anyway, for one of these big international institutions. They very strongly hinted that Ukraine is in a very real danger now of hyperinflation. It's defaulted on its debts. It's had to seek a restructuring. It's running a massive deficit. And they basically said that it's got to stop money printing and start, putting its financial house in order. The head of the central bank, the Ukrainian central bank, has now weighed in and said essentially the same thing. Very difficult to see how Ukraine can do that in the middle of a war. How does Ukraine reduce spending when it's having to fight a war like the one it's fighting now? I mean, what it needs is peace, but of course it's not seeking peace. Instead, it's continuing to fight, losing lives, losing territory. I mean, we've been hearing more reports of incremental Russian advances in Donbass, and it's having to spend a vast amount of money to keep the war going.
The U.S. Embassy in Kiev has issued a warning for everybody to leave, pretty much. Erdogan has said, as he was at, I believe, some sort of agricultural event, he said that Zelensky is panicking because he feels that forces in and around him are undermining him. We have more and more drones over Crimea, and it looks like they're monitoring the situation, looking for weak spots in Russian air defense. And we have the EU's Borrell, who was in Spain and said that the European Union is going to be setting up a massive training initiative in Europe for Ukrainian troops to continue to fight the war so that they can extend this war out.
Yeah.
What do you say to all of this?
Right, let's start
with a very, very long war.
Absolutely. Let's talk.
They're looking for a very long war. The collective West, they want to extend this out.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about Borrell first. I mean, since when has the European Union been involved in military training? I mean, with every single day that passes, you can see how the European Union's character is changing increasingly from this economic arrangement that it originally was into a kind of political military alliance attached to NATO as well. And yes, they're talking about this major training exercises for Ukrainian troops. Borrell wants this war to go on forever. He doesn't want negotiations. He doesn't want any kind of peace agreement. He's sacrificing thousands of Ukrainian lives to achieve this. He is destroying the European economies. We're going to deal with this in a separate program. It's a time someone told him to stop, because however many Ukrainian troops he trains, without arms supplies, Ukraine can't continue the war. Without an economy, Ukraine can't continue the war. We see arms supplies are dwindling and the economy in Ukraine is collapsing. And meanwhile, the European economies are coming under increasing pressure. I think it's long overdue that the obsessions of people like Borrell were, put to one side. And, we stopped being led into these dark places by these people who obviously have these enormous complexes about Russia and who want to see this war continue basically until, well, I don't even know what exactly. I mean, so that's all I wanted to say about that. By the way, I should say I'm sceptical. I mean, who in Europe is going to train these Ukrainian troops? Germany? Germany's military is actually fairly disorganized. It's going to have problems doing that. There's only two countries, in my opinion, that can provide training amongst the European states. One is France, which does have an effective military. The other is Britain. Britain isn't part of the European Union. It's already providing training to Ukrainian troops. I've seen this discussed in many places. The amount of training the Ukrainian troops are getting in Britain is very superficial. It's very limited. It's probably simply going to make them even more vulnerable when they get to the battlefields. France, well, they could start training Ukrainian troops, but nothing like on the kind of scale that Borrell is clearly talking about. So I suspect it's a fantasy. It's a dangerous fantasy, and it's one we need to put a stop to. Now, these drone attacks or hovering over Crimea, again, pattern of escalation. It does look as if somebody is thinking about launching some kind of major attack on Crimea. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons itself to do that. So the big question is, who's going to supply those weapons? I can't help but think that there's a major argument going on within the US again, between the hardliners, the neocons in the State Department, the CIA, the White House, who want to supply these ATACMS missiles, these big rockets, these 300-kilometer rockets to Ukraine, and probably the more realists, people in the Pentagon, who say, you're taking leave of your senses. This is a very dangerous escalation. We don't want it to happen. There's always this tug of war. The hardliners tend to win. They always, it seems to me, ultimately have the backing of the president. Highly likely those missiles will be supplied. Highly likely some kind of big missile strikes are going to be made in Crimea. All that they're going to do is harden Russian determination to end this war. It's going to lead to further, deeper Russian advances, deeper into Ukraine itself. It's going to end up badly for Ukraine. And of course, it could cause the Russians to escalate even further. And as for Zelensky becoming increasingly paranoid, convinced that he's not being told the truth by people around him, no longer trusting people, I've no doubt at all that what Erdogan says is absolutely true. Are you surprised? Surely, in the kind of position that Zelensky is in, it would be very astonishing if it were otherwise. It does make me wonder, by the way, to what extent Zelensky is, who exactly it is that Zelensky is afraid of in this kind of situation. Is it the far right in Ukraine? Does he control these people? Is it the military? His relationship with General Zaluzhny is said to be very bad. Could it be that he's afraid of others within his own entourage? But whatever it is, it doesn't paint a very attractive picture. And if the political centre in Kiev is that unstable, is that a government, going back to Borrell and the Crimean affair, is that a government that you should be supporting in the way that Borrell and the hardliners in Washington want us to?
Final question. If Borrell and the EU are planning to train Ukraine troops to fight Russia in various EU countries, why would Russia then not strike out at these training camps? Especially if Russia considers these training camps as aggressors to the Russian state, for example, or given what has happened the past couple of days, may even brand these types of camps or this state of Ukraine a state that sponsors terrorism, given the events of Dugina. I mean, it hasn't happened yet.
I mean,
anything's possible.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that's what the Russians will do, but, it's what the Russians might do. It's what the US historically has done in the past. As I said, it's a dramatic escalation.
Why would an EU country decide to host these training camps then?
Well, some people.
An Eastern European country, that's what it's going to be, or a Baltic nation.
Well, it will be. It will be an Eastern. I mean, it'll be presumably Poland. where apparently quite a lot of training already takes place, but it happens under the surface. But, you know, I know that for the Pentagon, that is their great nightmare. That, you know, there will be training camps established in Poland, that this will eventually act as a provocation too far for the Russians, that the Russians will then launch missile strikes against these training camps. And remember, the United States doesn't have the capability to intercept Kinzhal, these hypersonic missiles that Russia has. So what does the US do at that point? Does it respond militarily against these strikes, or does it allow Poland to dangle in the wind and see, you know, its NATO position crumble? Now, I'm sure there are people in the Pentagon who are going around trying to get the president, trying to get the hardliners to say, you know, this can't go too far. This is incredibly dangerous. What you're doing is utterly reckless. Let's accept the fact that the war in Ukraine is going wrong, and, you know, they may be already exerting some pressure. We've seen, as I said, military supplies decline. But logically, if the Russians were the United States, what you say is what they would do. They would launch those missile strikes, you know, in Poland. Why wouldn't they? But surely the rational thing to do is to prevent a situation like that from arising.
Borrell needs to shut up then.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, the trouble is, you speak of Borrell. You've talked about Ursula. You called her Ursula von der Crazy. I mean, I think that there is something, frankly, deeply irrational about all of this. It's these people have this visceral obsession with Russia, and it's driving them forward to do ever more reckless and ever more dangerous things. And you mentioned this individual who the Russians say carried out that assassination in Moscow, this murder of Dugina. Well, she's now apparently on EU territory. The Russians are entitled legally to seek her extradition. I mean, they would be. This is a private murder, if you like. It's a murder on Russian territory. It's unequivocally a murder. When that extradition request comes, of course the EU will make sure it's not granted. But you can already start to see the kind of slope they're in, that they're in effect, if they start to refuse extradition requests, they're countenancing murders in a foreign capital.
All right, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com, everybody, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.